The father's justice. I never imagined that the exact moment my marriage ended would arrive so quietly. No warning, no raised voices, no dramatic build. Just a single sentence spoken over my body as I lay motionless on the ground. My name is James Carter, and that night, I was staring up at a ceiling I could barely focus on, trying to understand why my legs refused to respond, why the signals I sent never came back. There was no pain at first, just a strange, hollow absence where movement used to live, a silence inside my own body that felt louder than anything I had ever heard. I remember the sound of voices around me, blurred, distant, almost unreal, until one of them cut through everything with perfect clarity. Emily's voice, my wife, calm, impatient, almost annoyed. "Walk it off! Stop being a baby!" The words didn't just land. They settled into something deeper, something colder than the floor beneath me. I tried to move, just a small shift, a reflex, anything to prove her wrong, but nothing happened, not even a twitch. And in that stillness, something inside me began to fracture in a way I knew could never be repaired. I wasn't just lying there unable to move. I was lying there realizing that the person who was supposed to stand beside me had already chosen not to. 7 years of marriage, reduced to a moment where she didn't step forward, didn't kneel beside me, didn't even question what had just happened. She dismissed it, me, as if I were an inconvenience interrupting her evening, and that was the moment clarity arrived. Sharp, precise, undeniable. This wasn't a shock. This wasn't confusion. This was recognition. Because deep down, I had seen pieces of this before. The small dismissals, the quiet alignments, the way she never quite stood between her family and me when it mattered. I had explained it away every time. I told myself it was nothing, that it would pass, that people don't reveal who they are all at once. But lying there, staring at the ceiling, unable to feel my own legs, I finally understood something I had been avoiding for years. This wasn't the beginning of the problem. This was the result. And as the noise around me grew louder, footsteps, voices, someone saying my name, I stopped trying to move and started asking a different question entirely. How did it get here? And more importantly, who had already decided I didn't matter long before I hit the ground? If that night felt sudden, it was only because I had spent 7 years pretending it wasn't building. The truth is, nothing that happened on that floor was new. It was just the first time the consequences became impossible to ignore. From the very beginning, the Cooper family had a way of making me feel like I was standing slightly outside the frame, present, but never fully accepted. Diane Cooper mastered it in the quietest ways, a smile that never reached her eyes, a pause before using my name, the subtle correction of anything I said, as if accuracy itself belonged to her. It was never loud enough to confront, never clear enough to accuse, but always there. Hannah Cooper followed a different pattern, lighter, more careless, but just as telling. She would ask questions about my work with a tone that suggested the answer wouldn't matter, laugh a little too quickly when I spoke, scroll through her phone while I was mid-sentence, as if my presence was optional. It sounds small when you say it out loud, almost insignificant, but repetition has weight. And over time, those moments began to stack, one on top of another, creating a kind of pressure you don't notice until it starts shaping how you move, how you speak, how much space you allow yourself to take up in a room. But Ryan didn't deal in subtleties. He preferred impact, physical, direct, and always just ambiguous enough to dismiss. The first time was at a family cookout, a shove from behind while I was standing near the grill, hard enough to make me stumble, not hard enough to draw immediate outrage. He laughed. Other people laughed. And when I turned around, he had already shifted into something else, something casual, harmless, untouchable. I remember steadying myself, brushing it off, telling myself it wasn't worth escalating, that it was just one moment. It wasn't. There were others. An elbow during a casual football game that lingered a second too long, a hand on my shoulder that tightened just enough to send a message. Text messages that walked a careful line between sarcasm and threat, each one slightly more pointed than the last, always calibrated, always deniable. And every time, I chose the same response. Not because I didn't see it, but because I did. I'm not someone who reacts quickly. I don't raise my voice. I don't create scenes. I observe. I measure. I document. That's how I've always approached problems, not emotionally, but structurally. Where is the stress building? Where is the weakness forming? And most importantly, when does it become critical? So I watched. I kept track. I remembered details most people would forget, not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. Because somewhere along the way, I realized this wasn't about isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a system, one that had been allowed to exist because no one had ever forced it to stop. And Emily, she saw it too. I know she did. Not all of it, maybe not every moment, but enough. Enough to understand who her brother was. Enough to recognize the tension in the room when Ryan got too close, too loud, too physical. And every time, she chose the same thing I did, silence, but for very different reasons. I told myself I was being patient, that I was choosing the right moment, that not every problem needs an immediate response. And for a long time, that felt true, until the pattern stopped being contained, until the small moments stopped being small, until the night it finally broke. And by then, it wasn't just behavior anymore. It was evidence. I've never been the kind of man who reacts in the moment. Not because I don't feel things, but because I've learned that reactions are rarely where real control lives. My work taught me that long before any of this began. I'm a structural engineer, which means I spend my days studying systems under stress, identifying weaknesses that aren't always visible at first glance, and understanding exactly how and when something will fail. Structures don't collapse because of one loud moment. They collapse because of repeated pressure, ignored fractures, and a failure to address what was already there. People, I've learned, they are not so different. So when things started to feel off with Ryan, with the way the Cooper family interacted with me, I didn't confront it. I didn't argue. I didn't demand respect. I documented, quietly, methodically. The first entry wasn't even intentional, just a mental note after that cookout shove. But after the second, the third, the pattern became clear enough that ignoring it would have been a mistake. So I stopped treating those moments as isolated incidents and started treating them as data. I began saving everything: messages, timestamps, details most people wouldn't bother remembering. I took a photo of the bruise on my forearm after that cookout, not because it hurt, but because it existed. I wrote down what happened during that Thanksgiving football game, the angle of the hit, the reaction afterward, who was present. I preserved text messages from Ryan that hovered just beneath what anyone would call a threat, each one a little sharper than the last. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It was structural. And once I understood the structure, I knew I needed someone who understood the system it would eventually enter. That's when I reached out to Walter Hayes. Walter doesn't rush conversations. He listens, the kind of listening that makes you realize how much you've already organized your thoughts before you even speak. His office was quiet, controlled, everything in its place. I laid everything out for him. The incidents, the messages, the patterns. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He just took notes. When I finished, he looked at me and asked a simple question. What outcome are you preparing for? Not hoping for, not fearing, preparing for. That was the moment everything shifted from observation to intention. Because the truth is, I didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew enough to understand that it wouldn't stop on its own. Systems like this don't correct themselves. They escalate until something forces them to stop. Walter told me I was already ahead of most people, that having a documented pattern changes everything when the time comes. Then, he gave me one instruction. Keep going. So I did. I kept recording, kept organizing, kept building something that didn't look like much on the surface, but underneath, it was becoming very precise, not a reaction, not revenge, a structure. one that would hold, when everything else eventually didn't. By the time we arrived at Diane Cooper's house that evening, everything already felt decided, even if no one had said it out loud yet. The place looked exactly the way it always did, polished, controlled, carefully arranged to project a certain kind of quiet superiority. Warm lights, soft music, voices layered over one another in that effortless way people have when they feel entirely at home. Emily stepped inside and disappeared into it almost immediately. Laughter, greetings, familiarity. I stayed near the edge of the room for a moment, taking it in, the way I always did, observing before moving. There were maybe 30 people there, friends, neighbors, the usual circle that had seen this dynamic play out for years without ever quite naming it. I got myself a drink, found a spot near the back where I could see most of the room, and settled into that familiar role, present, but slightly removed. It didn't take long. Ryan Cooper found me within minutes. He always did. "James," he said, my name landing somewhere between acknowledgement and interruption. He stood too close, not enough to be called out, but enough to be felt. His posture was relaxed, but deliberate, like he was already performing for an audience that hadn't fully gathered yet. "You look tense," he added, scanning me with that same half-smile I had come to recognize. Not friendly, not hostile, something in between that allowed him to shift either direction whenever it suited him. "I'm fine," I said, keeping my voice level. He let out a quiet laugh, just loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "You always say that," he replied, "like you're calculating something." He wasn't wrong. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a conversation. It was positioning. He wanted a reaction, something small, something he could build on. That was how it always started. A comment, a nudge, a test, and then, depending on how it was received, escalation. So I gave him nothing. For a while, the night moved on. Conversations shifted, music softened, and people relaxed into the rhythm of the party. But I could feel it, the way pressure builds in a system long before anything actually breaks. Ryan drifted through the room, louder now, more animated, drawing attention without ever fully asking for it. And then, at some point, he crossed the line he had been approaching all evening. I heard his voice from across the room, not just speaking, performing. There was a small group gathered around him, the kind of loose circle that forms when someone decides they're the center of something. He was telling a story, exaggerated, casual, designed to get a reaction, and then I heard it, my name, woven into the punchline in a way that made the laughter shift. Not genuine, not comfortable, just enough to keep things moving. I set my drink down, walked toward him. Slowly, deliberately. The room didn't stop, but it changed. Conversations quieted just enough. People turned slightly, sensing something without fully committing to it. When I stepped into that circle, Ryan looked at me and smiled. The same easy, practiced expression. "James, we were just—" "Say it again," I said. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear. The kind of clarity that removes options. The laughter stopped. Completely this time. The air tightened, the way it does when something real enters a space that was built for something lighter. Ryan held my gaze for a second longer than usual, weighing it. He could still turn it into a joke, still deflect, still walk away without losing anything. But that wasn't who he was. "Relax," he said finally, shrugging slightly. "It was just a joke." It wasn't funny. For the first time that night, the balance shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to name it, but enough. Enough that the room felt different. Enough that Ryan had to make a decision. And I saw it happen. That moment behind his eyes where he recalculated, where the performance dropped just slightly, and something more direct took its place. He stepped closer, closing the space between us in a way that looked almost casual from the outside. "Come on," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. Firm, controlled. "Let's step outside." It looked friendly. It always did. I turned toward the back, moving in that direction without resistance. because at that point, I already understood what was coming. Not the exact moment, not the exact angle, but the pattern had reached its critical point. And once a system reaches that point, it doesn't de-escalate. It resolves. I stepped onto the back porch, the noise of the party dimming slightly behind me, replaced by the quieter hum of the outside air. For a second, everything felt still, balanced. Like there was still time for this to end differently. Then I heard movement behind me. Too fast. Too committed. And in that final fraction of a second, before impact, I understood something with complete certainty. This wasn't an accident waiting to happen. This was a decision already made. The impact didn't feel like chaos. It felt precise. 2 arms, full force from behind, no hesitation, no misstep, just intent carried through to its conclusion. Ryan Cooper didn't shout, didn't warn, didn't lose control. He committed. My body lifted for a fraction of a second, and then met the hardwood at an angle that made the world collapse into something smaller, tighter, quieter. The air left my lungs in a single, involuntary breath, and for a moment I thought that was the worst of it. It wasn't. I tried to move. Nothing happened. Not weakness, not pain, absence. My legs weren't heavy. They simply weren't there anymore, in any way that mattered. I sent the signal again, slower this time, more deliberate, the way you do when something doesn't respond the first time. Still nothing. That's when the silence inside my body became something else, something sharper. Awareness, the kind that arrives without permission. Voices started to gather around me, overlapping, shifting, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But none of them reached me the way hers did. Emily. She stepped into my field of vision, looking down at me with a kind of restrained irritation, as if I had created a problem she now had to manage. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw concern. A flicker, something human, something that belonged to the person I thought I had married. Then she spoke. "Walk it off, James. Stop being a baby." The words landed with more force than the fall. I looked at her, really looked this time, waiting for the correction, the shift, the realization that something was wrong, that I wasn't playing along, that I couldn't, but it never came. She held her position, arms folded slightly, expression tightening instead of softening. Not fear, not confusion. Dismissal. I tried to answer her, to tell her I couldn't feel my legs, but even that felt distant, like my voice had to travel through something thick before it reached the surface. "I can't," I managed, the words barely forming. Behind her, Hannah Cooper appeared, already holding her phone up at an angle that told me everything I needed to know. Not shocked, not urgency, framing, recording. She leaned slightly to the side, trying to capture more of the scene, her voice cutting in with a sharp edge of annoyance. "Oh my God, he's doing this on purpose. You're ruining everything." Everything. Not my body, not what had just happened, the moment, the party, the narrative she had already decided this belonged to. I could see the screen in her hand for a second. My body on the ground, unmoving, reduced to content before the situation had even been understood. Diane Cooper stood further back, near the doorway, exactly where she always positioned herself, close enough to observe, far enough to remain untouched. Her arms were folded, her expression composed, almost analytical. She didn't step forward, didn't ask a question, didn't intervene. She watched. The same way she had watched everything else over the years, with a quiet acceptance that allowed it to continue. And Ryan stood off to the side, just beyond the immediate circle, his arms crossed loosely, his posture relaxed. He wasn't panicked, he wasn't uncertain. He was watching the outcome, the way you watch something you've already decided will go your way. That same half-smile rested on his face, unchanged, as if the scene unfolding in front of him had simply confirmed what he expected all along. For a moment, I wondered if anyone in that space was going to recognize what this actually was. Then someone moved. Luke Bennett. He pushed through the edge of the crowd with a kind of quiet urgency that didn't need to announce itself. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission. He crouched beside me, one hand steady on my arm, grounding me in a way that cut through everything else. "Don't move," he said, low and controlled. Not loud enough to draw attention, but clear enough to take control of the moment. "Just stay still." It was the first instruction that made sense. The first response aligned with reality. I focused on his voice, on the steadiness of it, letting it anchor me while everything else continued to fracture around us. He glanced once at my legs, then back at my face, and in that brief exchange, I saw something I hadn't seen in anyone else in that room. Recognition. Not of me, but of the situation. And just like that, the narrative shifted. Not in the room. Not yet. But underneath it. Because while voices continued to argue, dismiss, and minimize, while Emily held her ground, while Hannah kept recording, while Diane remained still, and Ryan watched from a distance, someone had finally seen what actually happened. And that was the moment everything stopped being contained. Because once something is witnessed clearly, it can't be undone. The shift didn't happen all at once. It happened the way it always does when something crosses from private to undeniable. At first, it was just motion, controlled, purposeful movement, cutting through the noise that had taken over the porch. The paramedics arrived without urgency in their faces, but with precision in everything they did. One of them knelt beside me, her hands steady, her voice calm in a way that didn't invite argument. "Can you feel this?" She pressed along my leg, firm, deliberate. I focused, waited, tried to answer honestly. "No." She moved again, different point, same question. Nothing. There was no reaction from my body, and more importantly, no surprise in hers. She didn't look at me like I was exaggerating. She didn't look at Emily. She didn't look at Ryan. She looked at the position of my body, the angle of the fall, the distance between where I lay and where the conversation had started. She was mapping it, not emotionally, but professionally. "Don't move him," she said, not loudly, but with enough authority that the space around us adjusted immediately. "We're stabilizing." The room didn't quite, but it lost control. Another paramedic moved in, preparing equipment, coordinating without needing to explain. They asked questions, not about feelings, not about interpretations, but about sequence. What happened? How? From where? I answered as clearly as I could. Each word slower than the last, my focus narrowing to the structure of the moment rather than the chaos surrounding it. Behind them, I could feel the shift beginning. Not in tone, but in direction. The lead paramedic stood, stepped slightly aside, and spoke into her radio. The words were measured, clinical, but there was something underneath them that didn't belong to routine. Requesting police support. Not protocol. Not precaution. Assessment. Because by then, she had already decided. This didn't align with a simple fall. And once that conclusion exists, everything that follows changes. By the time they moved me onto the stretcher, the atmosphere had fractured completely. The conversations that had once overlapped now broke into fragments, defensiveness, confusion, denial. Emily tried to explain, to reshape what had happened into something smaller, something manageable. Ryan said very little, which told me more than anything he could have said out loud. Diane remained where she had been, composed, but no longer detached. Hannah lowered her phone, not because she understood, but because the moment had shifted beyond what she could control. Then came the sirens. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. A signal that what had started as a family moment had moved beyond the boundaries of that house. At the hospital, the process continued with the same precision. Scans, tests, questions repeated from different angles, not to confuse, but to confirm. And every answer aligned with something the medical team had already begun to suspect. This wasn't accidental. The language changed first in tone, then in clarity. Words like impact, force, inconsistent with a fall. Each one is placed carefully, deliberately, but is impossible to ignore once spoken. They didn't accuse. They didn't speculate. They documented. And documentation, when done correctly, doesn't leave room for reinterpretation. By the time David Collins stepped into the room, everything had already been set in motion. He didn't arrive with urgency, he arrived with understanding. A quiet presence, controlled, observant, absorbing the details that had already been established before he asked a single question. He didn't need to rush. The system was already working. "What do you remember?" he asked, pulling a chair closer, his tone steady, neutral, but focused in a way that told me he was already placing each piece where it belonged. I told him, not emotionally, not defensively, just clearly. And as I spoke, I could see it, the way the structure of the case began to form in his mind, not as a family dispute, not as a misunderstanding, as an event, one that had crossed a line that doesn't move back. Because the moment the evidence aligns, the moment the pattern is recognized, it stops being personal and becomes something else entirely. Something that doesn't get resolved in living rooms or explained away over conversations. Something that gets written down, processed, and carried forward. From that point on, it wasn't about what anyone in that house believed anymore. It was about what could be proven. And that changes everything. By the time the hospital settled into that quiet, controlled rhythm, everything I had prepared in the background began to move into place. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of precision that only comes from something built long before it's needed. I wasn't reacting to what had happened on that porch. I was activating what I had already put together. Walter Hayes didn't need a long explanation when I called him. He already knew the framework, the incidents, the timeline, the pattern I had been documenting for months. When I told him what had happened, there was a brief pause on the line. Not surprise, not shock, just confirmation. "All right," he said finally. "Then we move." That was it. No hesitation, no emotional reaction, just execution. Within hours, everything I had collected stopped being private notes and became part of something formal. The photos I had taken, the bruise from the cookout, still time-stamped and preserved. The written account of the Thanksgiving incident, recorded the same night it happened, while every detail was still exact. The messages from Ryan Cooper, each one saved with metadata intact, showing progression, tone, escalation. Individually, they could be dismissed. Together, they formed something else. Structure. Walter organized it the way someone does when they understand not just the law, but how patterns reveal intent. Each piece was placed in sequence, not to tell a story, but to demonstrate consistency. Behavior repeated over time, escalation without consequence, a line crossed, again and again, until it wasn't a question of if something would happen, but when. And then we added the piece that changed everything. Noah Simmons. I hadn't spoken to him directly before all of this, but I knew enough to understand his significance. 2 years earlier, he had lived near Ryan. There had been an incident, one that never fully surfaced, resolved quietly, contained within pressure and silence. But records exist, even when people try to move past them. And when Walter reached out, Noah didn't hesitate. He gave a statement. Clear, direct, unambiguous. What had happened to him wasn't identical, but it didn't need to be. The details aligned where they mattered. The method, the intent, the aftermath. It wasn't just another incident. It was context, the kind that shifts a case from isolated to systemic. And that's when everything changed. Because until that point, there was still room for interpretation. A fall, a misunderstanding, a moment that got out of hand. But once the prior behavior entered the record, once a second instance existed that followed the same structure, the narrative collapsed under its own weight. This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. And patterns, when documented properly, don't argue. They don't exaggerate. They don't need emotion to be understood. They simply exist. And once they're recognized, they redefine everything that came before them. Walter called it exactly what it was. Pattern of violence. Not a phrase meant to provoke, but one that carries weight in the only place that matters at that point. It reframes the entire case, changes how it's evaluated, how it's processed, how it moves forward. From that moment on, Nothing about this situation belonged to interpretation anymore. Not to Emily, not to Diane, not to anyone who had stood on that porch and decided what they believed in the moment. Because belief doesn't hold up under structure. Evidence does. And what I had built, quietly, patiently, without confrontation or noise, was now doing exactly what it was designed to do. Not react. Do not escalate. Resolve. The collapse didn't come all at once. It moved in sequence, the way systems fail when every supporting point begins to give at the same time. Ryan Cooper was the first to feel it. The charge was filed quietly, without spectacle, but the language carried weight. Felony assault, serious bodily injury, terms that don't bend easily once they're set in motion. At first, he treated it the way he treated everything else, like something that could be managed, minimized, explained away. But that posture didn't last. Because once the evidence was organized, once the pattern had been established, the room for denial narrowed faster than he expected. His attorney understood it before he did. You could see it in the way communication shifted. Shorter, more controlled, less confident. Negotiation replaced deflection. Strategy replaced bravado. And outside of the legal process, the rest of his life began to adjust accordingly. The youth program he coached suspended him pending investigation, a temporary decision that carried permanent implications. People who had once stood close began to create distance, not dramatically, not publicly, just enough to avoid being part of the fallout. Reputation doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes, quietly, consistently, until what once felt stable becomes uncertain. Hannah Cooper experienced it differently. For her, the shift wasn't procedural, it was immediate. The video she recorded, the one meant to capture something trivial, embarrassing, disposable, became something else entirely once it entered a different context. 17 seconds. That's all it took. My body on the ground, unmoving. Emily's voice is telling me to get up. Luke beside me, steady, controlled. No lead-up, no explanation. Just the aftermath, clear enough to raise questions that couldn't be ignored. It didn't stay contained. Once it surfaced, it spread, not because anyone forced it to, but because people recognized what they were seeing. The reaction wasn't coordinated. It didn't need to be. Comments, messages, and conversations that moved faster than any attempt to control them. Hannah's presence online shifted almost overnight. What had once been casual, curated, controlled, became something she couldn't manage. The response wasn't kind. It wasn't measured. It was direct. And it forced her into silence in a way nothing else had. Diane Cooper's situation was quieter, but more consequential. She hadn't touched me, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't participated in the moment the way Ryan or Hannah had, but she had been there. She had known. And more importantly, she had allowed a pattern to continue inside a space she controlled. That distinction mattered, not emotionally, legally. When the civil case expanded to include her, it wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as responsibility, prior awareness, failure to act. A history that had been acknowledged privately but never addressed publicly. The messages recovered during discovery made that clear enough. Not speculation, not interpretation. Documentation. And once that entered the process, her position shifted. Assets tied to proceedings. Decisions delayed. Stability replaced by uncertainty. Not because of a single moment, but because of everything that had led up to it. What connected all of it? Ryan's charge, Hannah's exposure, Diane's involvement, wasn't the incident itself. It was the structure behind it. Because once a pattern is recognized, once it's documented and placed into a system designed to evaluate it, the outcome stops being personal and becomes inevitable. Emily came back alone a few days later. No family, no noise, just the two of us in a room that felt quieter than anything we had shared in years. She sat down across from me, hands folded, posture controlled, the same composure I had seen so many times before. For a while, she didn't speak. And I let the silence sit between us, because I already knew this wasn't going to be an apology. When she finally did speak, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't defensive, it was something simpler. I knew he was capable of this. 7 words, no explanation attached, no attempt to soften them, just a statement, delivered too late to change anything. I looked at her for a long moment, not searching for more, just confirming what I had already understood. It wasn't the words themselves that mattered, it was the timing. The fact that she had known, and chosen to do nothing. Not before, not during, not when it mattered. I know, I said. And I did. That was the end of it. Not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing needed to. The structure of our marriage had already failed long before that night. What she said didn't break it. It just removed any remaining illusion that it could be repaired. The legal process that followed reflected that same clarity. There were no arguments, no drawn-out conflict, no emotional negotiation. Everything moved through the system the way it was designed to, efficiently, precisely, without unnecessary friction. The prenuptial agreement we had signed years earlier did exactly what it was meant to do. It defined boundaries, protected what needed to be protected, and removed ambiguity from a situation that could have easily become complicated. Emily's attorney reviewed it, challenged what could be challenged, and then stopped. Not because he agreed with it, but because there was nothing unstable in it to exploit. Every clause held. Every condition is aligned. In the end, she walked away with what she had brought into the marriage. Nothing more. No leverage, no extended claims, no room to reinterpret what had already been established. It wasn't harsh. It was exact. We didn't have a final conversation about it. There was no closing argument, no attempt to revisit what had already been decided. Just signatures, filed documents, and a quiet acknowledgement that what had existed between us no longer did. 7 years, resolved in a process that didn't require emotion to function. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not the conflict, not the outcome, the absence of anything left to say. Because when something ends like that, clean, controlled, without resistance, it doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like completion. Recovery didn't arrive all at once. It rebuilt itself in quiet, repeatable steps that no one else could see. The first time I stood without support, it lasted only a few seconds. But it was enough. Enough to remind me that control isn't something you wait for. It's something you take back, piece by piece. Physical therapy became routine, not something I fought against, but something I respected. Each movement, each small improvement, carried more weight than anything dramatic ever could. By the time I walked out on my own, slowly, steady, but without assistance, the legal process had already reached its conclusion. Walter Hayes handed me the final outcome with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. Ryan Cooper had accepted a plea, the terms structured, unavoidable, and final. The civil settlement followed, not as revenge, not as compensation alone, but as acknowledgement of what happened, of what it costs, of what could no longer be ignored. Everything closed exactly the way it was supposed to. Not loudly, but completely. I moved into a new place shortly after, smaller, quieter, without history attached to it, no tension in the walls, no unfinished conversations waiting in the corners, just space. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I returned to work, not as someone recovering from something, but as someone who had already moved through it. One evening, as I sat alone in my car, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. A short message. No explanation. I read it once, then again, and allowed myself a small, controlled smile, not because of the words themselves, but because I understood what they represented. Closure doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just arrives, quietly, exactly when it's no longer needed. If there's anything this taught me, it's this. Money can shift power. People can hide behind comfort. But respect is never something you can demand or buy. It's revealed in moments where it would cost something to give it, and in silence where someone chooses not to. And sometimes, that silence tells you everything you need to know. So I'll leave you with this. When the people closest to you show you who they are, do you confront it immediately, or do you wait until the truth reveals itself on its own?